One component that is heavily used in Microsoft 365 is the Fluent 2 menu control. This component provides a context menu to a button and shows additional options the user can take action on. Context menus are not widely used in Power Apps, but they are a powerful tool to add to our design toolbox. In this video, we'll look at how to create the Fluent 2 menu in Power Apps. Let's get started. As we've learned in previous videos, a good place to start building our component is to review the documentation for the control. Looking at the Fluent 2 documentation, we can see that the menu control is a hidden list of options that's shown when someone interacts with a trigger component, like a button, an avatar, or an icon. We can see from this page that there are actually 3 different types of menus: a default menu, which treats each menu item as a button, a checkbox-like menu experience, and a radio button experience. This video is going to focus on the default menu experience. For the layout, it's recommended to organize your menu items in a way that makes sense to the user. The highest traffic items should be at the top of the menu, and the lowest traffic items or the highest risk items should be at the bottom. Further down in the Fluent 2 documentation, we can see that menus are constrained to a max width of 300 pixels. While we aren't constrained to this in Power Apps, it's still recommended to keep your menu items short and to the point. We don't want to overload the user with text to read. And on the topic of our button's text, if our menu items are triggering some sort of action for the user, it's best to use a verb as the text of the label to indicate this. For menu items like options or settings, using nouns or a short phrase is also recommended. With all that covered, we have a pretty good foundation for what we're trying to accomplish in our Power App. In a future video, we may also look at an advanced version of this component, allowing for the checkbox and radio button experiences, as well as features such as dividers. For the purpose of this video, however, we'll just be looking at implementing the context menu so that you can start using it in your apps. Let's hop over to our app and we'll start building. We'll first navigate to our components and we'll add a new component named Fluent 2 menu. We'll start by adding in our custom properties to this component. We'll create an items property, and this will be a data input of type table. This is going to be what contains our buttons that will show up in the menu. Next, we'll add a property for button width. This will be a data input of type number, and it's going to tell our component what the width of our buttons should be. Next is the onSelect property, and this is going to be an event property which will be used to trigger a formula when the button is pressed in our menu. We'll add a required text parameter called item key in this case, as we'll need to pass an item key that we create with our menu buttons, and this will be how our component knows which button was pressed in the menu. Next, we'll add an auto height property, and this is going to be a data output of type number. We'll use this later on to automatically calculate what the height of our menu should be. We'll add a property called visibility, and this will be a data output of type Boolean. This is how we'll communicate to the individual instances of our control whether they should be hidden or visible. Next, we'll add set visibility. This will be an action property with an output of Boolean. We'll add a parameter for this called set mode, and this will be an optional Boolean. Now let's set some defaults for all these custom properties. For items, we'll set this to a table with one record present. The schema of this table should have an item key column, an item display name column, an item icon column, and an item enabled column. These items will eventually be passed into our buttons in our component. For button width, we'll just set this to 96, which should be the default of a modern button control. For onSelect, we'll set this to a simple switch function. For the first parameter, we want to switch on the item key, and we'll just input button 1 as the match for that switch. If it equals button 1, we'll just notify that button 1 was selected, and if not, the default should be an unrecognized button was selected. For set visibility, we'll create a variable called var menu visible. And the value of this variable is going to be the first non-blank value of either our set mode parameter or the opposite of the current value of the variable. What we're trying to accomplish here is if we want to programmatically close the menu for some reason, we can call this set visibility function and pass the value false into it so that it will force the menu to close. Otherwise, in most cases, we just want to flip the value to its opposite value. We'll see an example of this later on. Now that we've created our variable, we can go to our visibility property and set its value as var menu visible. This will communicate to our app whether the component should be visible or not. Now that our properties are created, let's go ahead and insert a vertical container in our component, and we'll name this container menu component. We want to set the x value for this container to parent.width divided by 2 minus self.width divided by 2. We'll go ahead and set the y value to 0 and the width to parent.width minus 4. For now, we'll also set the height to 64. This will change later to be dynamic. Next, we'll go ahead and insert a blank flexible height gallery into our menu component container, and we'll name this gal menu. The data source for this gallery will be fluent2menu.items, and we'll set the width to stretch with a minimum width of 0. For the gallery's height property, we want this to be dynamic based on the number of buttons in the menu. For now, we'll set this to self.allitemsCount times self.templateheight. We'll go ahead and set the template size to 32, and we'll disable the scroll bar. While we're here, we'll also change the template padding to 0. In the advanced properties, we'll also disable the loading spinner by setting the loading spinner property to loadingspinner.none. Next, inside our gallery, we'll go ahead and insert a button control named button menu. For the X and Y positions of this button, we'll go ahead and set those both as 0. This button should be tied to our items property in our component, so we'll go ahead and set those now. The text of the button will be this item.item display name, and the icon should be this item.item icon. For the display mode, we'll insert an if statement to check if this item.item enabled is true, and if so, the display mode should be edit, otherwise disabled. This way we can control from our items property whether one of the buttons in the component should be available to the user or not. In the onSelect property of the button, we'll call our onSelect event from our component. For the item key parameter, we'll need to pass in this item.item key. After we call the onSelect event, we also want to trigger our setVisibility event to close the menu. We'll add fluent2menu.setVisibility to our button's onSelect property. Next, let's go ahead and change the type of our button to the subtle option, and we'll set the font weight as normal. For the width of our button, we want to set this as parent.templatewidth. Now that our gallery and buttons have been created, we can go back to our other elements of our component and make them dynamic. For our menu component container, we'll set the height of this to the height property of our menu gallery. Then for the auto height component property, we'll set this to the Y property plus the height property of our menu component container, and we'll add 2 to this for some extra padding. With our auto height property set, we can go ahead and set the height of our component to self.autoHeight. Now our component will adjust its height automatically depending how many buttons we display. For our component's width property, we want to set this to our button width custom property plus 4. The reason for this is that we have a drop shadow effect on our menu component container, and if we don't allow padding on the sides, the drop shadow will be hidden. One important thing that we have to do is come back to our component, and we have to remove the default text for our set mode custom parameter in the set visibility custom property. If we go to the top left corner into the properties of our component, we can see under set visibility is the set mode option. This is currently set to true, and we need to remove this, or otherwise the menu will only ever be set to true. Let's go back to our screen and we'll go ahead and insert our component. Now, the way this component works is as a supplement to a button on the screen. So we'll also have to insert a button directly above this. To attach our menu to this button, we need to set the X and Y properties of our menu component to a formula that will set our menu component directly centered below the button. We'll select our component and we'll go to the X property. In our formula, we want to reference our button's X property, in this case button canvas1.x. From this, we want to subtract the width of our menu component minus our on-screen button's width, and we'll divide that value by 2. You can see that our menu is now centered on the button that it's associated with. For the Y value of our component, we want to set this as our associated button's Y property plus its height property. So in this case, it will be button canvas1.y plus button canvas1.height. With those two things done, we can now see that it is centered directly below the associated button. We also want to change our button width custom property so that it references the width of our associated button. Now, if our button changes width, we can see that it's updated accordingly in our menu component. The two last things we have to do is to set the visibility of our menu component to self.visibility. In our associated button, we'll go to our advanced properties and we'll select the onSelect property. This is where we can reference our set visibility custom event in our menu component. So this will trigger the set visibility event for the selected on-screen menu. If you have multiple menus on the screen, you can reference the individual menu that you're trying to activate. We can see that when we click the button, the menu disappears. The default state for the menu is hidden. When the button is clicked, the menu appears. If we click our button, we can see a notification for button 1 selected, as well as the menu disappearing. Let's go ahead and add 2 more buttons to our control. We've added button 2 and button 3, both with new icons, as well as item 3 having the item enabled field set to false. When we click our button, we can see our 3 menu options. For button 3, we can see that since the item enabled property of this button is set to false, we can see it doesn't allow us to click on this button. Let's look at an example of our control on a screen that uses containers. Here we have the sidebar screen template, and we can see our button control inserted in the main container. If we zoom in, we can see that when we click our button control, we can see our menu appear below it. This menu is actually inserted at the top level of the screen, so it's not inserted into any container. This allows it to move around to the button's location on the screen. The tricky part with this is we need to do a little bit of math to figure out where the X and Y coordinates of the button are inside of a container. So in this case, if we look at our menu component's X property, we can see we're adding together the left padding on the screen container plus the left padding of our main container plus the main container's X position on the screen. So how far to the right the main container is. And then we're subtracting 2 from that because we need our component to be centered on our button. If you recall, we're adding 4 to the button's width to account for the drop shadow that appears around the component. We need to subtract 2 in this case to center the component on the button, taking into account that drop shadow. For the Y property, it's a very similar story, except instead of working from left to right, we're working from the top down. In this case, we're adding the Y value of the bottom container plus the Y value of our main container plus the Y value of our associated button and the button's height. So again, there are 3 things to keep in mind when using this on a screen that uses containers. The first is to always insert the menu component at the top level of the screen, not in any containers. Secondly, for the X value of the component, you'll need to add together the X properties and the padding of any containers to the left of your button in order to get the value of where your button is on the screen. Then you'll need to minus 2 from that in order to center the menu on the button. For the Y property, you'll do something similar. So the third thing to remember is to just work top down for the Y property. In this case, adding the Y properties of the different parent containers as well as the Y property of your button and its height until you get to the point where the menu is directly below the button. Now let's look at another example of our component. We can see on this screen we have a table on the bottom section of the screen, as well as an Actions drop-down menu. When we click on the Actions menu, we can see that some menu options are displayed. These menu options are actually transparent, and the text and icons of these menu options are not aligned. So we'll go to our component and we'll fix these two things. For the button's text alignment, we'll select our button and then we'll go to the Align property and we'll set this to Left Align. For our container menu component, we'll go to the Color property and we'll set this as white. We'll go back to our screen and we'll zoom in again, and we can see now that our background is white for our menu and all of our icons and actions are now aligned. Selecting our menu component, I can show you what the X and Y values look like for this component. We're taking the X value of container 2, which is the container that our associated button is in, as well as our associated button's X property -2. That is centering our menu component on its associated button. For the Y property, we can see that we're taking the Y value of container 2, which again is the container that our associated button is in, as well as our associated button's Y property plus its height. These three things together are vertically aligning our component directly below the button. In our associated button's onSelect property, we can see that we're triggering the setVisibility command of our component. Let's go to our advanced properties of our component and we'll go to our onSelect action. In here we have the basic switch statement that we had put in as a template, but in this case let's associate one of our buttons from the menu. We'll need the item key of our first button, which in this case is just copy. And I can confirm that by going to the items property and seeing that our item key for this first item is indeed copy. Going back to onSelect, we want to check if this item key equals copy. And if so, we'll just set a record called var record, and we'll set this to the selected record in table 1. After that, we'll notify that the specific record we selected has been copied. If we go ahead and select a row in our table, we'll go to Actions and we'll select Copy. And we can see that the title of the item we selected is showing as copied. If we go to our variables in Power Apps, we can go to the global variable for var record. And if we view the record, we can see the information that got stored using our component. One drawback with this menu component is that in order for the user to close it, they either need to select the associated button again or select one of the items inside the menu. Another way to close this would be to set an invisible button over the entire screen that's only visible when the component is visible. In the onSelect property of this button, you could call the setVisibility function and pass in the value false to the event. Now when the associated button is selected, our hidden button is filling the screen, and if you click anywhere else on the screen, that's triggering the setVisibility event and setting the visibility of the component to false. You'll also see that I'm not able to select the buttons that are in our component, so you need to make sure that you set that invisible button behind the menu component, and that will allow you to select those other menu items. And that's about it. If you have any questions about this component, please leave a comment below. I know there's a lot of math in this video, and it's definitely complicated to set up once you have the component created. But I think the end user experience is worth the initial setup that comes with creating these components. If you'd like to see an advanced version of this component, let me know in the comments below. Also consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I hope you enjoyed the video and have a great day.